Okay, quick question. What do you get when you mix a scorching desert, a billionaire businessman, and a 100,000-year-old iceberg randomly floating in the middle of the ocean? Apparently, a plan to tow that iceberg across 12,000 kilometers of ocean. Yep, someone with a real business actually tried to tow an iceberg from Antarctica to the UAE. Not as a movie plot, not as a joke.
I'm not joking.
But as a serious plan to solve one of the biggest problems on Earth. And honestly, the craziest part isn't even the iceberg. It's what they thought would happen once it got there. Let's back up for a second. Why is there even a need to tow a giant mountain of ice in the first place? See, the United Arab Emirates is a country made almost entirely of desert. It gets almost no rain, and it doesn't have any rivers, but it has millions of people who need water every single day. So, where does that water come from? Well, they come from this: desalination plants. They suck in ocean water, strip out the salt, and turn it into drinking water. The UAE uses about 15% of all the desalinated water in the entire world. Yeah, wrap your head around that. But here's the thing, desalination is expensive. It uses a ton of energy, and it dumps huge amounts of salty waste back into the ocean, which is quietly destroying marine life in the Gulf. So the question is there a better way? Well, one guy had an idea. In 2017, an Emirati businessman named Abdullah Al-Shehi stood up and said, "What if we just went and got some ice?" His plan was called the UAE Iceberg Project, and it was exactly what it sounds like. Find a massive iceberg floating near Antarctica, lasso it with a giant belt, hook up a fleet of tugboats, and tow it slowly and carefully all the way to the coast of Fujairah, a city on the east side of the UAE. The journey was about 12,000 kilometers, and the time it was estimated to take was around 10 months to a year. But the reward was big. One single iceberg could contain up to 20 billion gallons of fresh water. That's enough to keep 1 million people drinking clean water for 5 years. Yes, 5 years. They'll start extracting fresh water from it the day it arrives. Oh, and as a bonus, Al-Shehi said, the iceberg floating off the coast would attract tourists, cool down the desert, and even cause rainstorms. All of that in the UAE, a country that barely gets any rain. So they said, sure, why not? Okay, so the plan sounds amazing on paper, but there's one problem. You can't just tow a giant block of ice through the ocean and expect it to show up fresh and intact. That's like leaving your ice cream on the dashboard in July and wondering why it's liquid by the time you get home. Scientists did the math, and the math was not great. The iceberg selected for the project was roughly 2 kilometers long and about 600 meters wide. That's almost twice the length of the Eiffel Tower laid on its side. And even then, nearly a third of it would still melt during the journey. Moving it would also need around 20 heavy-duty tugboats, all working at once, just to move it at half a meter per second, which is roughly the pace of a very slow walk. And once it crosses the equator, the iceberg would enter tropical waters with temperatures up to 30 degrees Celsius, some of the warmest seas on Earth. Oh, and the whole trip would cost somewhere between $100 to $150 million. But the melting problem wasn't even the biggest challenge. The route itself was a massive headache. To get from Antarctica to the UAE, the iceberg would have to go around the tip of Africa and up through the Indian Ocean. That route runs almost entirely against ocean currents. You'd basically be pushing a floating skyscraper uphill in the ocean for a year. There were also serious questions about what happens if the iceberg starts cracking. Icebergs aren't solid, like a cube of ice from your freezer. They have weak spots. And dragging something that enormous through rough seas could cause it to split apart mid-journey. At that point, you've spent $100 million and you've got a trail of ice cubes spread across the Indian Ocean, which is why they decided they would put a giant belt around the iceberg to stop it from splitting apart. And here's something most people didn't ask. Is all of this even legal? Because Antarctica isn't owned by any country. It's protected by international law. Nobody actually checked whether it was okay to just take a chunk of it home. Now here's something wild. Al-Shehi wasn't even close to the first person to think of this. Back in 1949, an American scientist named John Isaacs first floated the idea of towing icebergs to dry regions. His audience was California. Then in the 1970s, a Saudi prince named Mohammed bin Faisal actually funded a serious research project to tow an iceberg from the North Pole all the way to the Red Sea. His plan was to wrap the iceberg in sailcloth and plastic to slow the melting. All of this with a price tag of $100 million back in the 1970s. They even flew a 2-ton block of ice from Alaska to Iowa for a conference, just to prove that they could do it. The idea kept coming back, decade after decade, because the problem of water scarcity kept getting worse. And when Cape Town in South Africa nearly ran completely out of water in 2018, the iceberg idea got another serious second look. Scientists ran simulations for Cape Town and found that a smaller iceberg, about 300 meters long, could actually make it there with the right insulation wrapping. But the UAE trip is much harder and hotter, basically far more punishing than the previous proposals. Okay, remember at the start, I said the craziest part wasn't the iceberg itself? Here's the part I was saving. Al-Sheikh's team believed that if a massive iceberg sat 3 kilometers off the coast of the UAE, it would literally change the weather. Their theory was that the ice would cool the air above it. That cold air would mix with the warm, humid air blowing in from the Arabian Sea. This would create a vortex, like a mini weather system that would pull clouds over from the ocean and cause actual rainstorms in the middle of the desert all year round. They even claimed it could turn the empty quarter green within a decade, which is one of the largest and driest sand deserts on Earth. Now, to be fair, scientists said some local cooling effects are plausible. Ice that size would definitely do something to the local climate. But rainstorms all year long and turning the desert green? That's a stretch. But still, the core idea of having an iceberg create a small microclimate isn't totally crazy. So, what actually happened? Well, nothing, at least not yet. The UAE Iceberg project launched its website in 2018. Al-Sheikh filed patents in the UK for their belt. A scientific committee was set up. A pilot test near South Africa was planned for 2019. And then, silence. By the early 2020s, the whole project had quietly faded away from conversation. There's no record of a pilot test ever happening. No iceberg ever got towed. The plan for now has melted away, pun very much intended. But here's the twist ending nobody talks about. UAE didn't give up on polar ice entirely. They just scaled down, way down. Instead of a 2-kilometer-long iceberg, they started flying in small chunks of Greenland glacier ice to put in cocktails at luxury bars. So rich people are now sipping drinks cooled by ice that's over 100,000 years old. Look, the UAE Iceberg project may have stalled, but the problem that inspired it hasn't. The UN predicts a 40% global shortfall in fresh water by 2030. That's 4 years away. If you made it this far, you clearly like weird stuff, which means you'd probably enjoy my last video, in which I brought back an ancient Roman into New York City. Go watch it. I'll wait.